All right, I think at this point we'll get started. If people trickle in, great. So welcome everyone to this year's Constitution Day event sponsored by the Politics Forum. I am Professor Sarah Shartok, chair of the Political Science Department, and I'll be moderating today's talk, which I'm really excited for, knowing the little I know about what is to come. Before I introduce our esteemed speakers today, I wanted to just introduce Brittany Adelot, who is the director of TCNJ's Community Engaged Learning Institute, who is also heading up TCNJ Votes, for a bit about what is going on with TCNJ Votes right now.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me this morning. I just wanted to highlight a few things as this kind of kicks off our TCNJ Votes season. So you all should have gotten an email recently, students and faculty and staff, with our TCNJ Votes full list of things going on, but I will highlight a few for you. So TCNJ is part of the New Jersey State Ballot Bowl this year, which is a challenge to get students both registered to vote, but also pledged to vote. So in your email that we sent out, you can find the links to our TCNJ voter registration portal and the all-in pledge to vote. So for students on the webinar today, I encourage you to do that yourself, and for faculty and staff on the call, if you can help us encourage students to participate, that would be wonderful. I'll highlight a couple events coming up after today's. So on National Voter Registration Day, we're having a Voting in New Jersey kind of 101 panel and conversation with the Secretary of State, Tanisha Wei. Dr. Foster will be joining us for part of that one as well. To learn just about New Jersey voting. We have new early voting in the state. What does it mean for mail-in ballots after we just had a year where we had to do that? Where can you vote? Where should you register to vote? So if you can encourage students to come and learn all about that, that would be wonderful. During Voter Education Week, we have a couple events. The first is on October 5th. We're having the importance of knowing your local representatives and voting in local elections. And we have our local reps to TCNJ, Senator Turner, Assemblywoman Reynolds Jackson, who's also a TCNJ alum, and Assemblyman Varelli are all going to join us as well to talk about what they do, what their roles are, and why it's important to vote in your local election years as well. After that, on the 8th, we have two events. We have a civically engaged alumni panel. So we have some alumni that we've invited to come back and tell you about their careers and how they've gotten involved in politics and policy and advocacy after they left TCNJ, and what their advice is to students while they're still in college. So that'll be an exciting panel as well. And then also on that day, as part of Leadership Live, which is out of the Office of Leadership Development, Career and Leadership Development, we're gonna have the Leadership Live for this month with Dr. Foster and Student Government President Roshni Raji. And that'll be a conversation about what is leadership and why be politically and civically engaged also. We have a couple other events that are on the calendar after that to encourage people to vote and walk to the polls. So you can check out that email or the TCNJ Votes website for more information there. And the last one I'll highlight is there's a new program being offered as part of a collaborative for the state of New Jersey called Be a Civic Leader. So any individual students who are interested in participating in a 6th series workshop to learn more about how to be a civic leader in the state. We encourage you to sign up for those as well. And all that information can be found in your email and on the website. Wanted to just introduce today by sharing those opportunities as well. And we appreciate you including us in this panel. So I'll wrap up there, but if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or Vani Rana, who's my co-chair for TCNJ Votes. And hope you have a wonderful Friday. And I look forward to hearing the panel as we go.
Thank you so much, Brittany. So many great events, and looking forward to hearing more about those. So let me introduce our speakers today. And they are our own professor of history, Craig Hollander, and his co-author, Dr. Andrew Fagel. Dr. Fagel is an associate editor with the papers of Thomas Jefferson at Princeton University, where he has served as an editor since 2014. a political historian. He completed his PhD in 2013 at Binghamton University, State University of New York, where he authored a dissertation on the political economy of war in the early republic under the supervision of Douglas Bradburn. Andrew's peer-reviewed publications have appeared in a number of prestigious venues, and we're really, really happy to have him with us today. Dr. Hollander is currently Associate Professor of History here at TCNJ, where he came after serving as the Berman Postdoctoral Fellow in Princeton's Department of History. His dissertation, Against a Sea of Troubles, Slave Trade, Suppressionism During the Early Republic, won the 2014 C. Vann Woodward Prize in the Southern Historical Association and the 2014 Scheer Dissertation Prize, and his manuscript is currently under contract to be published as a part of University of Pennsylvania Press Early American Studies series. Just as a note, before I turn it over to our guests, Drs. Fagel and Hollander will speak for about 40 minutes, give or take, after which point we will have a Q&A session. But please, as questions arise from you, our audience, we're going to try out the Q&A button down below. So please go ahead and start putting those questions into the Q&A as they arise, and we will get to as many of them as we can in that Q&A session. So without further ado, I will give the floor or the screen over to Drs. Fagel and Hollander, and looking forward to the talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chartock, and thank you for inviting us, and welcome everyone. But like Professor Chartock said, this is actually a work in progress. Professor Fagel and I we have a draft of an article, which we're sort of circulating around to some editors we know. But we're anxious to hear your questions, in part because you may catch things in this presentation that we haven't yet considered. So we're excited for that component of this presentation. I'm going to get started. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully I remember how to do this from last semester. And I'm going to walk us through a PowerPoint presentation, and Dr. Fagel and I are going to comment on some of the images and some of the research that you're going to see. So bear with me for 1 second. Okay, so here, hopefully you can see the title slide. Andrew, you see it? All right, good. A Terror to Others, that's the name of our article. It comes from a quote that Thomas Jefferson wrote, basically outlining his strategy for suppressing the slave trade. He wanted to make an example of a few slave traders so that they would serve as a terror to others who would try and do the same thing. We're going to get to that. But it's Thomas Jefferson, the Constitution, and the Suppression of the Slave Trade before 1808. I know most of you in the audience are not history majors, or even if you are, you don't necessarily study early America or the 19th century and are probably unfamiliar with slavery and the slave trade. And that's okay. I'm going to provide you with a very brief overview of slavery and the slave trade. So first of all, what is slavery? Let's define our terms here. An enslaved person is considered the chattel property of another person, meaning that he or she is subject to sale and other forms of transfer. They are considered personal property for the most part. And very importantly, an enslaved person's services are always obtained through some type of coercion. It doesn't necessarily have to be physical coercion, although usually that is the underlying principle. It can be psychological or emotional coercion. And in all events, the enslaved person is subject to their owner's authority. Now, the Atlantic slave trade was a form of international commerce in which people from Africa were enslaved, forcibly transported from their homelands, and made to toil elsewhere, usually in the Americas, although not always. A lot of them wound up in the Atlantic Islands, some of them in Europe. Ultimately, slave traders brought to the Americas roughly about 11 million Africans, making Africans the majority of old world immigrants to the New World. And if you look at this chart here, this timeline on the right-hand side of your screen, you're going to notice that the period between 1750 and 1810 represents the peak of that traffic. with annual averages of about 60,000 victims per year who were successfully landed in the Americas. And they just represent the tip of the iceberg. Countless others were lost either in Africa itself or during the Middle Passage. Now, cumulatively, North America, meaning both colonial North America and the United States, only received about 5% of the total number of enslaved people who were transported from Africa and taken elsewhere. Okay, but it's that tiny fraction of the slave trade that I really focus on for my own research. So what does the Constitution say about slavery and the slave trade? Today is Constitution Day. That's why the political science department invited us here. So let's go back to the source. What does the Constitution say? Now, some of you are probably pretty familiar with this very contentious debate going on in the news today about whether the Constitution is an anti-slavery document or whether it is inherently a pro-slavery document. We're going to touch on some of those themes, but if you look at the Constitution itself, it's pretty clear that slavery, although it's never mentioned by name, is really baked into the cake. And it's in three areas in particular that scholars really point to. The first is the so-called 3/5 clause, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. It's cited a lot, but not often really understood. It does not comment on the humanity of Black people. It is basically saying that that for the purposes of apportioning representatives in the new Congress, as well as for taxation purposes, 3/5 of enslaved individuals would be counted for a state's population. Then there's the fugitive slave clause. Again, the word slave is never mentioned in any of the text. They use euphemisms instead. They're talking about, person held to service or labored, people who are held to labor in one state. Basically, that clause says if you're made to labor in one state and then you escape, it's incumbent upon the state that person escapes to return that person to their original place of origin. The clause that we're going to focus on today is this one, the slave trade restriction. It says the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808. And then it says you can have a tax on it, on this importation of people, but Congress can't otherwise restrict it. Oddly specific, okay, that they came to this date, 1808. And that was the result of a lot of bargaining. Okay, this is one of the great compromises of the Constitutional Convention, that Congress would not be allowed to prohibit the slave trade into the United States until 1808. Now, what Congress and what the framers of the Constitution did not necessarily anticipate was that most of the states were going to take it upon themselves to ban the slave trade anyway. Okay, they were going to enact their own individual bans on the importation of slaves into their states, and they would restrict their citizens from engaging in the foreign slave trade well before 1808. So throughout the late 18th century, most states placed those bans on their citizens, and by 1798, every state in the Union had some slave trade ban already in place. Georgia was the last state to actually prohibit its citizens from importing enslaved people into their state, and that took place in 1798. Now, I've taught classes on the transatlantic slave trade at TCNJ since I've gotten here, and whenever we pull up this chart, it kind of sparks a lot of questions. This is a chart showing the imports of enslaved people into the United States, and what you'll immediately notice is that in the early 19th century, there's a huge spike, okay? And that seems kind of incongruous with what I just said previously, which is that every state had banned the slave trade by 1798. And yet in the early 19th century, in other words, a few years later, there's this sudden resurgence of the slave trade. And all my students, when they see this chart, they say, well, what happened? And it's very clear from the record what happened. South Carolina, the state of South Carolina, repealed its long-standing ban on the importation of foreign slaves in 1804. And for 4 years, until 1808, South Carolinians basically tried to import as many enslaved people as possible into the state. The question I always had is, why did that happen, right? And there were a couple traditional answers in historiography, one of which is that, well, they were trying to hoard as many new slaves as possible prior to the ban that Congress would enact in 1808. But I thought that needed a little bit more nuance, that was a little too much of an easy out. I mean, this is such a huge discrepancy that I thought there had to be more to the story. And so I turned to my colleague and good friend, Dr. Fagel, who I met at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies a few years ago, and is an expert on Jefferson. And I said, hey, listen, Dr. Fagel, there's this big blip on the radar that takes place during the Jefferson administration. Could it be that Jefferson was just turning a blind eye to this traffic? Why did South Carolina do this? What's going on here? And so we put our heads together and we went back to the sources. And before we get to what we found, I want Dr. Fagel to give you a little bit of an overview of Thomas Jefferson, because again, I'm sure most of you are not, all of you have heard of Thomas Jefferson. I'm sure most of you are not experts on his biography or his political ideology. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fagel.
All right. Well, I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with Jefferson, or at least you ought to be. With Jefferson, the big things is that he's one of the most important founding fathers of early American history. He writes the Declaration of Independence. It's revised by committee, and that's what literally declares the independence of the United States. During the 1780s, he serves as America's minister to France, where he is heading up U.S. foreign affairs during the Confederation period, and thus he's not in Philadelphia to take part in the Constitutional Convention. But had he been in the United States, he almost certainly would have been there. Jefferson then becomes the first Secretary of State, serving under President George Washington, and later the second Vice President of the United States in 1796, until that's later fixed during the 12th Amendment. In 1800, Jefferson is elected president, and it's during his presidency that you have the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Which literally doubles the size of the United States. This is one of those big picture items that's covered in every high school class on early American history. And Jefferson leaves the presidency in 1809. So what did we know about Jefferson and the slave trade coming into this? And the answer is not a lot, is that that's not a topic that historians have tended to focus on. When it comes to Jefferson, I mean, obviously a big, important figure, and historians have thus tended to study Jefferson and his relationship to the institution of slavery, because he was a slave owner. He owned over 600 people over the course of his life. And we also know a lot about Jefferson and his views on race and how they changed over time, both very important things. But what he does with regards to the slave trade is kind of more big picture aspects. So we know that in the draft of the Declaration of Independence, he condemns it. But that's later taken out when South Carolina and Georgia object to that in the Continental Congress. We also know that it's during Jefferson's presidency that he signs into law the act that bans the slave trade, effective January 1st, 1808. But other than that, this Jefferson and the slave trade itself has not been a topic that many scholars have looked at, perhaps because the assumption going into this is that we tend to associate Jefferson with this idea of states' rights, that the federal government should not do things that the states are competent enough to do. And that's where the action against the slave trade is mostly focused at the state level with these state level bans. But what did the archives tell us of when we started looking into this question? And it turns out some of the early things that we looked at is there's this one individual. He's a former slave trader. He writes this long epic poem to Jefferson in the summer of 1804, or spring of 1805. And he asked Jefferson for something simple. Could you please endorse my poem, just so I can publish it and say, Thomas Jefferson is a subscriber to this poem. Get extra money for the guy. And Jefferson doesn't write back to that individual, but he writes back to his friend who also lives in Philadelphia. And he tells him that he agrees with the purposes of this individual's poem condemning the slave trade, but that he's not going to sign on to it. He says, should an occasion ever incur in which I can interpose with regards to the slave trade with decisive effect, I shall certainly know and do my duty with promptitude and zeal. And so the question is, did Jefferson actually ever interpose decisively with regards to the slave trade, or was he just writing some flowery language to his friend George Logan? And one of the first things that we were able to look at and find is that, yeah, a big case that comes out during Jefferson's presidency right about the same time is this individual named Nathaniel Ingraham. And Ingraham is convicted in the Federal District Court of Rhode Island for having violated a federal law prohibiting American citizens from participating in the slave trade. Ingraham asked Jefferson for a pardon. He gets a letter signed by a who's who of the state of Rhode Island. The governor, the former governor, both senators, both former senators, the congressional representatives, pretty much everyone. And what Jefferson tells them, writes back to his friend and political ally, who's a senator from Rhode Island, that no, I'm not going to pardon this individual until he's served at least 2 years in prison for this crime. He wants it to be, and this is where the quote, a terror to others comes from, is that he wants the Ingraham example to be, quote, a terror to others for those meditating the same crime. And that's pretty significant because Jefferson, as president of the United States, he has ultimate pardon authority for federal crimes, and he is pardoning people left, right, and center. As long as lawyers and the judges endorse the pardon, he'll pardon an individual for certain crimes. Not so in this case. And so what this led Craig and I to argue is that, yeah, what Jefferson said to Logan is true, is that he took effective and purposefully unheralded actions against the slave trade throughout his presidency. These actions took the form of cabinet leadership, executive orders, and exerting pressure on Congress. These actions that he took then filtered through the federal bureaucracy, becoming the laws and policies that federal officials, such as customs collectors, revenue cutter captains, that's the early form of the Coast Guard, district attorneys, federal marshals, and others would wield against slave traders at times with great success prior to the federal ban on the slave trade in 1808.
Just because I'm anticipating some questions here, Dr. Fagel, do you want to briefly tell us why he was so concerned with remaining sort of out of the limelight when it came to the suppression of the slave trade?
Yeah, is that he thinks that there will be political blowback if he takes a decisive stand on an issue. He believes that there's going to be political blowback on this particular point, and he saw this time and time again. So in 1776, when he writes the draft of the Declaration of Independence, it's Georgia and South Carolina who successfully object to the language condemning the slave trade. During the Constitutional Convention, even though Jefferson's in Europe, he's being apprised of it by his friends. Edward Rutledge, who had opposed, from South Carolina, who had opposed the draft of the Declaration, writes Jefferson saying, "My state just prohibited the slave trade." Jefferson writes back, "That's fantastic news. People who oppose the slave trade are entitled to the first rank in heaven." At the same time, he gets a letter from his friend George Mason of Virginia, who had been at the Constitutional Convention and opposed the Constitution, ultimately opposed the Constitution. And one of the reasons why Mason said so is that at the very end of the ratification debates, Georgia and South Carolina again were able to get in this 20-year extension prohibiting the federal government from taking action on this point. And so Jefferson once again sees that, okay, once you have an actual debate on these issues, it's going to be very hard to get real action done.
And Jefferson in
particular, behind the scenes.
And politically, Jefferson had spent the last 15 years, in fierce political combat. And he had come to realize that anything he did, no matter how ostensibly popular it was going to receive a lot of pushback from his opponents. It would be politicized instantaneously. And here he thought, I can really do some good, but I have to stay out of the picture while doing it, which made our jobs as historians a little bit more difficult because we really had to go search for his imprints on the evidence to see what he was actually up to. But in a lot of cases, lo and behold, we were able to find it. And one such case was in the case of the Sally.
Yeah, so this is the very first case where we have Jefferson's direct fingerprints detailing how the federal government should prosecute individuals who are engaged in the transatlantic slave trade. This is important because in 1794, after every single individual state had banned the slave trade, Georgia bans it in 1793, the federal government passes a law prohibiting American citizens from participating in the trade and from fitting out vessels in American ports for foreign ports to engage in the slave trade. So the intent of the law is that if you're building a slave ship in the United States, that's a crime, which itself is not a violation of the constitutional prohibition. So the question then is how effectively was this law enforced? And the first evidence we get of this is in the fall of 1801, when a ship called the Sally sails from Charleston, South Carolina.
Wait, let me just stop you right there. Andrew, let me stop you right there. Let me just reiterate that. It's not being enforced very well. Okay. Throughout the 1790s, when the Washington administration and the Adams administration were sort of presiding over the federal government, these state bans were not very effectively enforced. And the federal government was very, very limited in the way in which it prosecuted slavers. That begins to change as soon as Jefferson comes to office.
Right. So with this particular case, is the ship sails out to the Atlantic, storms beat it back to the Chesapeake Bay, and instead of sailing to one of the major ports like Norfolk or Baltimore, the captain takes it to a very small port up the Patuxent River. And the customs collector becomes aware of this. And in conversation with the Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, decides that he's going to unload all the cargo from the vessel and see what's up, because this is pretty suspicious. And it turns out that the hold of the ship is filled with everything you would need for a slaving voyage. Handcuffs, wood to build bunks, as well as prison holdings in the ship itself, and enough food for hundreds of people. And so Albert Gallatin discusses this with Thomas Jefferson of what to do. Should we prosecute in this case? And Jefferson responds that the handcuffs and bolts are palpable testimonials of the intention of the voyage, and the concealment of them and their omission in the statement of the cargo strengthens the proof. The traffic, referring to the transatlantic slave trade, is so odious that no indulgences can be claimed. And so within a week, this case is all the evidence is forwarded to the U.S. Attorney for the District of Maryland in Baltimore, who brings a case against the captain of the vessel, and it goes to trial within a month. The problem is that the defense attorneys successfully argue that there is no the law of what constitutes as fitting out. So just because you have handcuffs and bolts in the cargo hold of your ship, does that mean that it's going forth as a slave voyage? And so the administration loses this case, but they do appeal it up to the Supreme Court. And the legal issues where they do lose in 1805 when John Marshall decides not to hear the case. But this is the same argument that's going to come up in the next case that we do have a lot more evidence for as well. And that's the case of the young Ralph, which takes place in early 1802. And this is a case that really ought to be more famous than it is because it pits two legal geniuses of the early republic, Edward Livingston, who most likely you've not heard of, but also Alexander Hamilton, who you have heard of. The young Ralph was a ship that was originally built in Liverpool, England, a center of the slave trade, purpose-built for the slave trade. It goes on two separate voyages in the late 1790s. And on its third voyage, it's captured by French privateers, brought into New York City, where it's later sold to a Danish merchant. This Danish merchant then is about to sail the ship to the coast of Guinea in Africa, at which point in time, two Quakers in New York City alert the customs collector that there's a slave ship destined for Africa. You should arrest it. The customs collector, in conjunction with the captain of the revenue cutter, arrests the vessel, and they turn the case over to the U.S. Attorney for the District of New York, Edward Livingston, who then brings charges against the vessel. Hamilton is engaged by the defense to represent them, and we have the case file that happens to exist in the Edward Livingston papers. that was not known to the editors of the Hamilton papers when they were publishing this back in the 1960s. And we see this great, for most legal cases, witness testimony does not exist anymore. It was not written down. Here we have Edward Livingston's notes on the actual trial and how it progressed. And we see, we see this argument that, similar to the case of the Sally, the ship has 100 pairs of handcuffs on board. It has a boiler and food necessary to feed hundreds of men. It has enough. It has medicines on board to keep about 200 people alive. So this is a purpose. So the argument that they have is that this is a purpose-built slave ship. And Hamilton comes back with a similar argument to the defense attorneys for the Sally case. No, the law does not specify what is fitting out. They could merely be transporting these handcuffs to Africa to sell to other people who are engaged in the slave trade. Just having handcuffs on board is not enough to prove that this is in fact a slave ship. And so the administration loses this case as well. But it appears from everything we've been able to find that the ship, the Young Ralph, never go, like the Sally, these ships do not go on to a career in the transatlantic slave trade. The Young Ralph apparently gets sails for St. Kitts in the Caribbean, where it's later condemned as unseaworthy and is destroyed. So despite the fact that they lose these cases, these ships don't make an actual slave trading voyage.
But you can start to really feel the frustration of the Jefferson administration with having these high profile cases, bringing to bear as much federal resources as they can and still losing, because the statute in 1794 was so poorly written that it basically allowed for these lawyers, like good lawyers like Hamilton, to argue, we don't know what constitutes fitting out a slave ship. At what point is it fitted out? I mean, these handcuffs could be ballast, right? We just don't know. When is a crime actually being committed? And so the Jefferson administration is very frustrated, and they use the legislative tools in their toolbox to try and strengthen their resources that they can bring against the slave trade. And one really fascinating and completely overlooked piece of legislation emerges from this in 1803. Sometime in 1802, the administration is alerted from some officials in South Carolina and Georgia that there is an ongoing traffic of foreign slaves coming into the United States who are being smuggled in, and they react. They don't just stuff this in a drawer and let it sit. Instead, they issue circulars to whatever federal officers are stationed in Georgia and South Carolina, saying you need to be more vigilant, you need to watch out for this. But at the same time, they go to Congress and they say, let's try and do something about this. Now, that constitutional ban on the ability of restricting the federal government from banning the slave trade is on their minds, okay? And they're trying to get creative. How do we basically circumvent the Constitution? How do we try and federalize all of these state bans on the slave trade so that we can actually use federal resources to enforce the suppression of the slave trade and not just rely on the states themselves to, and in the case of South Carolina and Georgia, to do a pretty bad job of actually following through with their own individual bans. And what they do is, and this is with some of Jefferson's top lieutenants in Congress actually spearhead this effort. They draft a bill to take all of these state bans and say, if a state has already banned the slave trade, which by this point was all of them, that becomes a federal crime. And that allows the federal government to sort of supplement those state bans with additional penalties. And it allows federal officers, who of course have more power, to use their to actually get involved in these cases and use it becomes part of their jurisdiction. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the debates surrounding this law have been lost. And that's probably why you can't really find a lot about this law in the history books. But if you go to the newspapers, you'll see it's there. And it was hotly debated even in 1803. And there were questions over its constitutionality. Here you see one newspaper that we found where a gentleman, Representative James Mott from Middletown, New Jersey, okay, representative from New Jersey, specifically says, is this constitutional, right? I mean, the Constitution explicitly says that Congress does not have the right to ban the importation of anyone until 1808. And yet, you know, here we are debating a bill that would do just that. I mean, let's not beat around the bush here is what they're saying. Like, we all know what we're trying to do here by federalizing these state laws. Nevertheless, despite these constitutional objections, the bill passes, and Jefferson passes by a large majority, and Jefferson quickly signs it into law. And so this is a fascinating statute from a constitutional perspective. I've highlighted some sections here that we can read very quickly. You know, it's enacted that from and after the first day of April next, no master or captain of any ship or vessel or any other person shall import or bring or cause to be imported abroad any Negro, mulatto, or other person of color, basically into the United States, into any place or port that in which by law has prohibited or shall prohibit the admission or importation of such Negro, mulatto, or other person of color. In other words, we are saying that if a state has already banned the slave trade, it is now considered a federal crime as well. And again, by that point, every state had banned the slave trade. So for all intents and purposes, this was a ban on the slave trade 5 years before Congress was constitutionally allowed to do that, okay? And there were some very stiff penalties that were brought to bear against anyone who was caught bringing in an enslaved person into the United States. And you can read some of that here on the other highlights. One other key point, it explicitly talks about the kind of federal resources that the government can use to quash the illegal slave trade. It shall be the duty of the collectors and other officers of the customs and all other officers of the revenue of the United States in the several ports or places situated as aforesaid to notice and be governed by the provisions of the laws now existing of the several states prohibiting the admission or importation of any Negro, mulatto, or other person of color as aforesaid. In other words, it's now federal officers. It's incumbent upon federal officers to help the states with their own individual bans. And right away, the Jefferson administration takes this law and says, we're going to focus like a laser on South Carolina and Georgia, where we've been told there is this illegal traffic of enslaved people into those states. And if you look at the records, first of all, Albert Gallatin, the Secretary of the Treasury, right away reprimands some of his underlings for basically turning a blind eye to this traffic. Andrew found this remarkable letter where he scolds a customs collector in South Carolina by saying, hey, listen, I heard that this brig was seized at Charleston after landing 149 Africans on Beaufort Island. You know, what were you doing? Where were you? You know, such a daring violation of the state laws and of the act of Congress of the last session. In other words, that 1803 law must not be suffered to pass with impunity. It is above all important that you should take the most efficacious measures to detect all those who may have been concerned in order that the penalties may be recovered and the Africans taken from those who may have them in their possession. Okay, so right away, they're not just saying this law is now in the books and, you know, there we did something. They're saying, no, we are going to enforce this. And the officers who are not doing a good job, you know, they're in trouble. Okay, and, you know, receiving a letter like this must have been pretty nerve-wracking. I've been to the National Archives for the Southeast region, and they are filled with cases from 1803, 1804, 1805, where the federal government tried to enforce this new statute. And for the most part, they were very successful, and they're aggressive. We found cases where they are condemning ships for having one enslaved person on board. Okay, in other words, a ship was coming in from the West Indies, let's say, and when they dock, it's found that that person is on board, and the entire ship is condemned. Okay, and here you see the case of the Amelia, in which, if memory serves, is about a ship that came in with, I think, 14 or so enslaved.
7, yeah.
How much was it?
It was 14 white refugees from the island of San Domingue.
Right.
And 7 enslaved persons.
Yeah, these is not the transatlantic slave trade. These were white refugees from a civil war going on in Saint Domingue, which later becomes the Republic of Haiti that year. And these white refugees had brought their enslaved property with them. And it didn't matter. Okay, for the purposes of from the perspective of the Jefferson administration, they said, no, these are foreign enslaved people. They are not allowed into the United States. This entire brig is going to be seized, and these people are going to pay a penalty. And this kind of federal action really ruffled the feathers of a lot of planters and merchants on who were living in places like Savannah and Charleston. And Professor Fagel and I began to wonder, was this one of the reasons why South Carolina reopens the slave trade in 1804? Now, just to give you some historical context, South Carolina had banned the international slave trade since 1787, okay? And in 1803, as late as 1803, they had a voice vote. Sorry, 1802. They had a voice vote in the South Carolina legislature, basically saying, yeah, of course, we're going to keep this ban in place, no problem. All of a sudden, the next year, it flips, okay? And they decide to repeal their ban on the slave trade and reopen the slave trade. Now, traditionally, historians have explained this by saying, like I said before, they want to hoard enslaved people before the total ban takes place in 1808. A lot of other historians have postulated, let's say, that Jefferson is negotiating for the purchase of Louisiana, as Dr. Fagel mentioned earlier. They're going to have all of this new territory that's going to be opened, presumably for slaveholders. And wouldn't it be great if Charleston could serve as an entrepot for enslaved Africans who could then be resold to new territories for slaveholding in the Louisiana territory, especially places like New Orleans. And so they thought South Carolinians basically want to be middlemen for these new areas of settlement for slavery. But if you look at the vote breakdown, what happens when we actually looked at the votes, the people who flip from 1802 to 1803, December 1803, when South Carolina repeals its own ban, are people from the low-lying areas of the Low Country, okay, around Charleston, South Carolina. And it's really not the upcountry planters who had been clamoring for more slaves for over a decade. The people who flip are these people who are engaged in international commerce, okay, who are merchants or who have friends who are merchants, and who are probably pretty angry that the Jefferson administration has been coming down very heavily on some of their voyages and looking for enslaved Africans and actually successfully prosecuting voyages from even places like the West Indies, where only a few enslaved people were found on these vessels. And so in December 1803, to everyone's shock, South Carolina repeals its ban on the slave trade. They say, no, we're done. Okay, the federal government is acting too heavy-handedly in the way it's prosecuting the suppression of the slave trade. And we didn't sign up for this. And so a lot of South Carolinians probably make the argument that it's unconstitutional what they're doing. They banned the slave trade before 1808 in effect. And we, in turn, are going to use our state government's prerogative of repealing our own ban and therefore circumventing this unconstitutional ban on the slave trade that the Jefferson administration has conducted. And universally throughout the country, South Carolina is condemned for doing this. And you can see a lot of sarcastic newspaper articles about the ensuing South Carolina slave trade, like this one here. To the honor of South Carolina, be it known that the following is a correct list of all the imported slaves advertised in one Charleston paper on the 15th of May. And a lot of these enslaved people are from East Africa. And the newspaper points out, oh, they're not just taking from West Africa. They're not satisfied with that. They're now taking them from East Africa as well. And South Carolina imports over 40,000 enslaved Africans between 1804 and 1808. And that accounts for this tremendous blip that I showed you earlier in the presentation. The Jefferson administration is also appalled by this, the way in which their effort to suppress the slave trade completely backfires, but they don't give up, which is also interesting in and of itself.
So even though South Carolina reopens its trade, the administration still has a few aspects of the previous 1794 law that they're going to try to enforce even after 1804. One of the big cases that we came across relates to this one slave ship called the Charles and Harriet. This was a ship owned by a Rhode Island merchant that sailed for Mozambique in East Africa. And coming back, it stopped in 1806 in South Africa, where the U.S. consul, which had just been taken over by the British, and the U.S. consul in Cape Town is able to get from the captains of the Royal Navy in that city a copy of all the ship's papers, which include about 30 manuscript pages of specific instructions from the owner of the vessel to the captain of how to avoid federal law prohibiting the slave trade. Things such as, go off with, when you go to Mozambique, pick up a cargo of humans, sell it to Montevideo in South America, and on your return trip, get big, bulky, smelly items like beef jerky and beef tallow to fill up the hold. So that will cover the smell, the horrid smell of the ships that are involved in the Middle Passage. And don't do anything to break US customs laws. So no individual can trade on their own account on this ship because it has to be squeaky clean when it comes back to Rhode Island. However, the US consul sends a copy of all these ships' letters to the Jefferson administration. Madison and Jefferson consult on this, and Madison sends all of those letters to the U.S. Attorney in Rhode Island, David Howell, to bring a case against the Charles and Harriet. And Howell does so. And as soon as the ship docks, they're waiting for it to arrest the captain and crew and the owner. The owner comes.
Sorry, this is only illegal because they went to South America. If they had gone to Charleston or South Carolina, it would have been perfectly legal. It's just to show you how difficult it was to pursue this kind of prosecution after South Carolina repealed its ban on the slave trade.
And so even though the administration loses in these cases, in this particular case of the Charles and Harriet, we think it is still this example of the extent to which the administration is willing to go to try to prosecute cases such as this.
They try rounding up witnesses from South Africa who saw this vessel there loaded with slaves. It's actually remarkable. And Madison is apprised of the process, throughout. He's like, he wants to be kept apprised of this prosecution. They're also, and Dr. Fagel found this note, which is just remarkable. You want to explain what we're looking at here?
Yeah, so this is from the 4th of July, 1805, Jefferson's orders to the Secretary of the Navy. After the Navy is involved in something called the Barbary War in North Africa. The Barbary War is wrapping up at this point. They're going to bring the fleet home. And what are they going to do with it? Well, they're going to use the part of the ships for anti-piracy actions on the eastern seaboard. But Jefferson includes specific instructions of who the U.S. Navy is not to protect. It's not to protect foreign vessels. That makes sense. But the second one is the Navy is not to protect American vessels engaged in the slave trade. So those are specifically the ships going from Africa to Charleston. The U.S. Navy is to afford them no protection whatsoever. And this order is eventually carried out by the Secretary of the Navy and issued to all the captains who are going to be patrolling the coast. So,
just to give you, just in sum, don't protect foreign vessels. Well, okay, we have very limited resources, can't do that. Don't protect American vessels engaged in any contraband commerce. Okay, don't protect smugglers, that makes sense. Finally, don't protect slave traders, even though that's perfectly legal. You know what? Screw those guys. Okay, screw them. Don't waste your time and effort trying to protect them. That's not my concern. Also in 1806, Jefferson finally comes out and very publicly says, I am looking ahead to the moment in which Congress can, for once and all, fulfill its constitution. The Constitution will no longer be a problem, and Congress can actually ban the slave trade. He says, I congratulate, this is in his annual message to Congress, which was the State of the Union back then. I congratulate you, fellow citizens, on the approach of the period at which you may interpose your authority constitutionally. Okay, in other words, there's no more objections, constitutional objections. You're going to, starting in 1808, that period is done, and I'm going to congratulate you in advance for doing what's right, which is banning the slave trade, to withdraw the citizens in the United States from all further participation in those violations of human rights which have so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa, in which the morality, the reputation, and the best interests of our country have long been eager to prescribe. In other words, we've always wanted to do this. Finally, the time is coming that we can. Although no law you may pass can take prohibitory effect till the first day of the year 1808, yet the intervening period is not too long to prevent, by timely notice, expeditions which cannot be completed before that day. In other words, it's a word to the wise. Like, even though we can't ban the slave trade until January 1st, 1808, a lot of vessels are going to be leaving their ports before that date, and they won't land until afterwards. And so now is the time to actually act and make sure those vessels can be prosecuted. Dr. Fagel, do you have anything to add to that?
No, and I mean, that's what Congress does, is they pass a law, that session of Congress, that prohibits the trade effective January 1st, 1808. And so if a ship had left before that date and then arrives after the January 1st, 1808 date, they're out of luck. There's no grandfather clause in the slave trade ban, and that's significant.
So, one of the big things we're trying to figure out is why did the Jefferson administration really bother to suppress the foreign slave trade? Traditionally, when people discuss the Jefferson administration, again, like Dr. Fagel said, they try and characterize its ideology in terms of protecting state prerogatives, state rights. That might be a little anachronistic looking back, but generally the Jeffersonians were against an activist federal government, a central authority that would govern very closely. For the most part, that's true. But I think that what we're trying to say is that Jefferson clearly thought that international commerce, including the traffic of enslaved people throughout the hemisphere, was one area where the federal government really did have the prerogative to act. And it's a lot of other scholars have said, starting with W.E.B. Du Bois back in the late 19th century, have said, well, people like Jefferson and Madison, other slaveholders who were against the slave trade, what they really wanted to do was stop the importation of new slaves into the United States so that their own assets, their own enslaved people would rise in value. Okay. That was one reason, one justification for why people like Jefferson were against the slave trade. Another was that they were also fearful of, inviting too many enslaved people into the United States, especially from the West Indies, who might prove to be rebellious and could pose a danger, a threat to the prevailing social order of the South. But when you actually look at these cases that Dr. Fagel and I have been studying, many of them have nothing to do with the importation of foreign slaves into the United States. A lot of them are like the Charles and Harriet, which really was concerned with prosecuting people who had been involved in the traffic of slaves between foreign ports. In other words, these were Americans who had engaged in the slave trade, but had no intention of bringing those enslaved people into the United States. And yet the administration really chased those people and tried to prosecute them. And so, Dr. Fagel, in your mind, what does that say about Jefferson? How does that shed light on how you would characterize him and his administration?
Right. So, I mean, at least in terms of how we think of the Jefferson administration, is that within the realm of what they thought was constitutionally permissible, that the federal government had the power to act. And that's what they tried to do. Furthermore, I think that this shows in terms of Jefferson that, he has, when we think of Jefferson as a slave owner, this is true, but he also has these very strong anti-slavery impulses where he talks about it, that he trembles that God is just. It was one of his specific lines from the Notes on the State of Virginia. And that he sees that the prohibition of the transatlantic slave trade is the first step that has to be taken in order to eventually rid the country of the institution of slavery itself. He writes that as early as 1774 in his Summary View of the Rights of British America, even before the American Revolution, that this is the first step that has to be taken. And so it literally takes about 40 years to take 30 years to take that first step, but that's what they do.
I mean, it's very easy to say and I do this all the time in my own classes. I mean, it's easy to say that Jefferson is being hypocritical in suppressing the slave trade while holding upwards of 600 people in bondage, including his own children. Okay. And this does not excuse the fact that he was a slaveholder. But what it does do is I think also show us how they thought the slave trade was manifestly different than slavery itself. Slavery was widespread throughout the world at the time. It had always been around. But someone like Jefferson was able to take a look at the slave trade and say, that was something very different, right? It's such a cruel institution that, what the slave trade represents is not something, is totally incongruous with the principles of the new American Republic. And we should take steps to disassociate ourselves from that evil. And I think psychologically, for a lot of slaveholders like Jefferson, it made them sleep better at night, knowing that they were, doing something against the slave trade. They probably thought to themselves, well, slavery isn't as bad as that. So, what I'm doing isn't, can't be considered, too evil as long as I'm taking steps to end the slave trade. I think that did provide him some form of comfort. Anything else to add to that, Dr. Fagel? So, it's Constitution Day. We wanted to end on, what do these successes and failures of the Jefferson administration tell us about the Constitution? I'll very quickly say that, and this is going to sound trite, but I want you to think about this. It shows us that the actual text of the Constitution really mattered. Okay. Now, in my book manuscript that I'm working on, I talk a lot about how the slave trade was one of these valence issues where Northerners, Southerners, slaveholders, non-slaveholders really came together and said, regardless how we feel about slavery or even race, we can all agree that the slave trade is bad. Okay. And it was a very comforting thought for Americans to come together on at least that one particular issue, even though they were fighting tooth and nail about innumerable other policies and had all sorts of ideological disagreements. This was a very tumultuous political era, but they came together and said, we agree that the slave trade is really bad. And yet, despite the popularity of the suppression of the slave trade and the fact that the Jefferson administration clearly thought they had the people behind them, they couldn't get around the text of the Constitution. That notorious compromise that was put in place when the Constitution was ratified, okay, that banned Congress from prohibiting the importation of certain persons that states, didn't want to, that states wanted to keep importing until 1808. They couldn't get around that. They tried to the point at which they, federalized state bans in 1803. And yet at the end of the day, South Carolina still had the state prerogative to say, enough is enough. We're pushing back on this. You've basically been pushing the Constitution too far. And we're going to remind you that we still have the right to repeal our own ban on the slave trade. And that's what they did. They basically reminded the Jeffersonians that, we still have this right according to the Constitution until 1808. And in that sense, there's also, I think this speaks to this idea that just because something is legal doesn't mean it's politically savvy. Obviously, Jefferson, hindsight's 2020, Jefferson couldn't anticipate that South Carolina would buck the way it did when he tightened the reins. But perhaps he should have thought about that. How far can we push these merchants in South Carolina before they use their own power to contravene this new federal law? And this backfired in a tragic way by South Carolina reopening the slave trade and allowing for upwards of well over 40,000 new victims to be imported into the United States. Dr. Fagel, any other closing thoughts?
No, I mean, I think we should get to Q&A.
All right, well, thank you all so much. We're really looking forward to these questions. I mean, as I've said before, this is a work in progress. And, we're excited to hear what you all think. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hopefully that worked. And if there's anyone who's still awake, I would love to hear your thoughts.
That was so fascinating. And we do have some questions already coming. So President Foster started us off with, I think, probably what most people were thinking. I think it was probably most of our first question, if we're not Jefferson experts, which is how do we square, right, this sort of what we all kind of know about the personal and public actions, and what felt like, was he called on this, right? Was this, and I think, Craig, you really did start to square those for us a little bit, right? That there was such a sort of an almost dichotomous perception of holding enslaved people and being in favor of the slave trade, which for a lot of us probably doesn't feel very different, right? But at the time felt somehow like a different phenomenon to people. So President Foster said you sort of answered that. I wonder if you could go a little further on why those were seen as such different phenomena for people. Again, given that those of us who study more contemporary events might not see them as so different. And then whether there was any sort of public facing backlash about that for that contradiction, or if it just wasn't seen as a contradiction at all.
Well, maybe let me answer the first part, and then maybe Andrew can answer the second part, if that's okay. So the first part, and this is really what my work is about, is how do you reconcile those two, right? Slavery and the slave trade are two sides of the same coin. There's no doubt about it. Slavery or forms of human bondage or coerced labor have been around since time immemorial. They're incredibly widespread. I always end my slavery classes, my courses on slavery, the slave trade, with books on modern day human trafficking as a reminder that it's still with us today, okay? That this has not gone away. But people like Jefferson were very well read and well educated when it came to the Bible and ancient history. They looked around at the Bible, they looked around ancient history, and they saw slavery was everywhere. But what they didn't see was the slave trade, okay? And again, they said, this is something very different. This didn't exist in classical times. It's not mentioned. Nothing like this existed in the Bible. There's something really wrong with this system. And again, for a lot of slaveholders, I think it fulfilled this psychological need to say, what we're doing is normal. What that is something really wrong. And therefore, let's work to end that. And also, like Professor Fagel said, there was this notion, especially among early abolitionists, that that's going to be the first step anyway. We can all come together, whether we're against slavery or for slavery, we can all come together in ending the slave trade, because we can all agree that that's something that's manifestly wrong. And for abolitionists, it was the first step on the road to abolition. Now, whether or not Jefferson believed that, or we can debate. But a lot of people who were against slavery certainly believed that. And for a lot of slaveholders, they said, that's just not something we want to be engaged in because it's very different than how we treat our slaves, right? And slavery, as common as it is, what we look to the Bible, we look to the classical times, slave trade's not there. And so it was a way of people could come together, but even if they disagreed on other issues.
And this, I think, is where the quiet aspect comes in. So our title is The Quiet Campaign Against the Transatlantic Slave Trade, because even if people will widely condemn the transatlantic slave trade, when the rubber hits the road, financial interests matter. And that's why Jefferson, in the summer of 1776, when he thinks he can get in this condemnation of the transatlantic slave trade in the Declaration of Independence, South Carolina and Georgia say, no, we're not going to sign on if this is involved. And so it gets taken out. So, so how do you actually get this, if there's something that's such wide agreement to, well, you have to do it quietly. So that's why there are no.
Otherwise it gets politicized. Right.
There's no public pronouncements on this until 1806, when he says Congress prohibit the transatlantic slave trade at your next session.
The closest other issue he comes to is in 1804. He's so outraged by what South Carolina has done that they basically changed the rules for immigration to the new Louisiana territory by saying you're not allowed to bring foreign slaves there. And that's a direct attack on South Carolina, saying you're not going to make any money on the slave trade by being the middlemen. And we're going to limit your ability to actually make money on that. And so, they really are outraged by this. So I think that Jefferson, does think he's doing the right thing here. And by the way, in terms from some broader context, this was seen throughout the hemisphere as being he's probably the United States is probably the most proactive government at the time when it came to suppressing the slave trade. No question about it. Britain gets a lot of acclaim, as it should, for its actions later on in the 19th century for suppressing the slave trade. But there's nothing like what the Jefferson administration is doing in the early 19th century. Britain doesn't ban the slave trade until 10 days after the United States does in 1808, or in 1807, taking effect in 1808. And the Jefferson administration is far out ahead of every other maritime government when it comes to suppressing the slave trade at this point. And he leaves office really thinking that he's done a huge, important thing for the world. And, it's right up there with the Louisiana Purchase as far as he's concerned. Dr. Fagel, do you want to weigh in on that?
No, I mean, just to note that the Nathaniel Ingram case that we mentioned earlier, as far as we're aware, it's the first case of any criminal penalty being enforced on someone for participating in the slave trade.
And it's not actually and Jefferson, even then, it's not actually for participating in the slave trade. It's that he couldn't pay a civil fine. And normally Jefferson pardons people all the time for civil fines, but he's like, you know what? Let him rot in debtor's prison because he was a slave trader.
Yeah.
So fascinating. And so I still, again, from my perspective, I still want to know more about that distinction, but I'll ask more later. But
there are people, your people spend their careers trying to understand Jefferson and get in his head. And it's the kind of thing that it's a kaleidoscope of different ideas at any given time. And you could go crazy trying to do it.
All right, let me move on to Professor McGreevy's question. He says, thanks for this fascinating talk. It's remarkable to see the effects of the Haitian Revolution on the South Carolina repeal. Didn't Jefferson condemn the Haitian Revolution? I wonder how we might square Jefferson's foreign policy with his position against the slave trade domestically.
Andrew, you take that one.
I'll take that. So what we think we know about Jefferson and the Haitian Revolution is there's a lot more to it. So during the period of Haiti's War for Independence, basically January 1802 until January 1st, 1804, there is a massive war that takes place on the island of Saint-Domingue, which ends up with a victory for the island's inhabitants and the declaration of the Republic of Haiti on January 1st, 1804. With that, the Jefferson administration refuses to reimpose a ban on the exportation of arms and munitions from the United States that had been in place since 1794. This is significant because it allows American merchants to sell weapons to the island's rebels. And there's a letter that General Leclerc, the French general, writes back to the French foreign minister in the summer of 1802, saying that the island's blacks have been armed with American muskets, American gunpowder, and so forth. We need to do something about this. And the French are very angry at Jefferson. And so this is an example of Jefferson's view of realpolitik, is that he is very much willing to allow American merchants to export arms abroad, especially to Haiti, because he realizes that if the goal is to get New Orleans and the ability to for American farmers in the Ohio River Valley to be able to sell their crops in the wider Atlantic market, they need New Orleans. And if they don't get it, that means that Napoleon's going to hold on to it and use that territory as a breadbasket for supplying the French Empire in Saint-Domingue, which was a big sugar producing colony, and sugar, one of the most highly taxed, one of the biggest revenue generators for early modern states. And so this is an example of, Jefferson is, essentially aiding the Haitian Revolution by not doing anything, and purposefully not doing anything.
So interesting, it sort of more having to do with strategy in terms of international politics, if we can call it that point. So another question from President Foster. Your scholarship has clearly uncovered some documents and evidence that are new to the history of the era and that shed light on constitutional and other questions. What are you hoping for and anticipating in terms of a reaction from fellow historians and constitutional scholars?
I mean, I don't want the headline. I don't want someone to read the headline of this and say, you know, scholars defend Jefferson and slavery. That's not what we're interested in doing. You know, and that's, you know, we're trying to provide the kind of nuance that avoids, you know, those sort of, you know, blanket statements. Because, you know, I don't think Jefferson saw this as an attack on slavery necessarily. I think that they thought that this was the slave trade, again, was something very different than slavery, and that this was a step in the right direction, and that he was trying to, I think, extricate American citizens from this immoral traffic. Now, were there ancillary benefits that he thought that were racist? Absolutely. Was he trying to preserve the whiteness of the Republic by limiting the number of Black people who could be imported in the United States? Did that occur to him? Probably, absolutely, right? But again, there are so many cases that we've uncovered that have nothing to do with the importation of enslaved people into the United States that you have to wonder, you know, when the federal government's resources were incredibly limited at that time, why he's concentrating on this issue. And it has to be because he saw this as an agent of corruption, right? It's promoting fraud, it's promoting perjury, it's promoting smuggling, violence, you know, sexual assault, murder on the high seas, piracy, and he's thought it's incumbent upon the federal government to do what it can to make sure our citizens aren't involved in this traffic.
Yeah, I mean, to be precise, I mean, we're hoping that the article and possible book project will be well received by historians and constitutional scholars. That's obviously the goal. And we hope that, you know, the amount of evidence that we've acquired in the course of doing the research on this will support that. But, you know, there is, I mean, clearly, you know, Jefferson and slavery and the founding is a big topic these days, especially in the public memory of this period. And so, yes, I mean, I think we're expecting some pushback. And this is the place for academic argument and scholarship. You know, we're not trying to defend Jefferson. Rather, we're trying to show the complicated nature of the relationship of the slave trade in the early American Republic.
I'm going to ask one last question I think we have time for, and it's from Dr. Touloudis. And I think it sort of brings together a lot of probably the discomfort that a lot of us have with a lot of this, which is the sort of politics around this as opposed to the people involved, right? And that there were people at the end, as you said, Dr. Hollander, sort of at the, you know, this is about people at the end of the day. So Dr. Touloudis asked, in your evidence that shows how vigorously the administration enforced the 1803 law, is there any indication of what the government did with the enslaved peoples on the ships that it seized? Like,
fantastic question. Fantastic question. So both the 1803 law and the statute that's passed in 1807 that finally closes the slave trade don't deal with this issue very well. Okay, basically they leave it up to the states to dispose of the seized cargo. Okay, now in the case of Georgia, this becomes incredibly controversial after the War of 1812. And this is really where I focus on this in my book project. Georgia gets into a lot of trouble because they start seizing enslaved Africans who are being smuggled into the state of Georgia. The federal officers, rather, they seize enslaved Africans who are being smuggled from Florida, from Amelia Island, into the state of Georgia. And Georgia takes those people and then sells them, auctions them off. Okay, and that's legal for Georgia to do. And they sell them for the benefit of their own treasury. They give some to whistleblowers, some of it's split for, you know, expenses and so forth. Some of them are loaned out to local planters. This causes a national uproar. Okay, once this is like sort of discovered in 1819, 1820, it causes a national uproar. And everyone throughout the United States says this was not the point of the 1808 statute. Okay, that's not what we were trying to do here. We were not trying to keep these people. They are victims. They are victims. And a new law is passed in 1819 under the Monroe administration. Monroe is a disciple of Jefferson, and where that law is changed. And the federal government actually appropriates money for repatriating people who are illegally smuggled into the United States, and they are repatriated in what becomes in West Africa and what becomes Liberia. Okay, so that law is changed, and it's because there was this national outrage over, again, the statutes were written poorly. Okay, and people, hindsight's 2020, people didn't anticipate that the states would do something as heinous as selling these captives who were considered victims. And that's what Georgia tried doing, and immediately Congress responded. So those laws were changed, but excellent question.
Yeah, and Nicholas, at least with regards to the 1803 law, I think we have about 17 cases from Georgia from 1803 to 1808. And in each of those cases, the charges are brought after enslaved persons have already been sold, and that it's the evidence that people have been sold, and now they're wherever they end up being. That ends up being the case that they're ultimately unrecoverable.
And we really tried tracking down these people. Like we're cognizant of the fact that we're talking about real human beings here, and so we actually end our essay with talking about some of the slave advertisements from that area, where clearly it's people who were illegally imported from some of the ships that we're talking about. They talk about some of the scarring, the ritualistic scarring, some of the languages they speak. And, we're trying to put two and two together here, that it was, to stop those kinds of advertisements and those kinds of slave sales, that the Jefferson administration was really trying to crack down on these importations.
Well, thank you so much for, depending on how you look at this this colloquium hour, we're officially done either way. But thank you both so much for bringing so much to our attention that I can't imagine. I think probably all of us learned so much from this talk, and also have a lot to think about conceptually with a lot that you gave us today. So we really appreciate you being here. Thank you to the audience for being here and for participating. And please look forward, number one, to, again, the TCNJ votes, information coming your way, as well as future politics forum events coming as well. And thank you once again.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks.